she's quoted responding to the film. When the film came out, they called her and she said, "It matters not, he's forgiven." So anyway, I knew she knew about the book also because the sisters had the book and had told me about the book. And so I said, just wanting to see what her response would be, there are people who say you don't need any more money, that you have millions of dollars and you don't even use it all. That's one of Christopher Hitchens' ideas in the book. And then she looked at me kind of quizzically, and then she looked at me in recognition and she said, "Oh, the book. It matters not, he's forgiven." Well, I didn't stop there. I said, "Well, yes, Mother, but he's pretty, he knows you said that, and he's pretty irate about it because he says he didn't ask you to forgive him and he didn't need to be forgiven." And she looked at me kind of like I didn't understand, and she said to me, "It's God that forgives. God has forgiven him. Ask the sisters." So when I got back to the place where I worked, I went to one of the permanent sisters that I worked closely with, and I asked her about the book. And she said, "Oh yes, we had one copy that a volunteer gave us, and we decided that all the permanent sisters should read it, and then we should come together and pray." So they had taken this one copy of the book, and all the permanent sisters read it. At that time, it took 9 years to become a permanent sister. Permanent sisters are the ones with the blue bands on the sari. And then when the last sister finished reading it, they fasted for 1 week, asking the Lord in their prayers what was the message for them from this book. And so I asked, what did the Lord say? And they said, "Oh, it's a call for us to become more holy." Now that had never been my response to Christopher Hitchens' book, but probably because I'm not a missionary of charity, but part of becoming more holy was their completely letting this go, completely forgiving him whether he asked or not, and beginning to pray for him. Because in the Missionary of Charity's Constitution, in addition to the poorest of the poor actually being people who are very poor economically, in their list of the poorest of the poor are atheists. So they believed that they actually had a call to pray for him. Now, after this experience, this vicious sort of rhetoric that's in his book, you all know how probably most of you know how Christopher Hitchens writes, it not only had not hurt them, but it had actually helped them advance spiritually. So they had no kind of hooks left on them. That is, this book didn't cause them to actually work less or it didn't interrupt their work. On the other hand, he became more irate, and you can see it. I think somebody told me he was interviewed not too long ago on 60 Minutes, and he's still pretty irate about it. I heard him in December debate William Dembski, and he went off again about her, but so he hasn't quite gotten over this. We all know people whose lives have been diminished, and in some cases, even for ourselves, from unforgiveness. Can't let it go. Just maybe it happened years and years and years ago. My pastor once said that unforgiveness was like drinking poison and hoping the other person died. According to Judeo-Christian tradition and worldview, as well as science, the universe is created to operate on laws. There are physical laws of nature, like gravity. There are also psychological laws, like forgiveness. There are economic laws, political laws, moral laws, social laws. All these laws ultimately come from a spiritual source. All things come into being from God's spoken word in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The law of radical forgiveness in Judeo-Christianity has 2 prongs. First is forgiving others immediately without being asked, even if they don't know they need to be forgiven. The model for this was Christ forgiving people while he was hanging on the cross. So one of the 7 last words is forgive them for they know not what they do. And he was asking the Father to forgive them. So that's the forgiveness that I just described of the Missionaries of Charity. The second forgiveness has to do with knowing thyself, like Socrates. I mean, Socrates believed that that was the basis of a good life, was first that you needed to know yourself. And to know yourself, then you realize that you're not perfect, that there are problems. In Judeo-Christianity, you confess those things, you repent of them, you confess them to God, and His responsibility is not only to forgive you, but actually to begin cleansing you from whatever the iniquity is that underlies whatever that problem has been. So we're forgiven when we miss the mark, which is sort of the definition of sin. Forgiveness is a law. It's a law in which human beings are made, according to Christianity, and around which, if we use it, human beings most optimally flourish. Breaking it will be like breaking the law of gravity. The results will be slower, but not unforgiveness will begin to result immediately in the diminishment of life. Just as surely as jumping off a building, only slower. Like Mother Teresa's visions and prayers, this was a spiritual transaction, not solely a human function or a psychological function. Forgiving others and being forgiven by God releases us into a more abundant and full life. Well, there are also secular solutions to these things offered in secular psychology for when we face these hurts of life. Let's look at some of these alternatives to the Judeo-Christian ones I've described. First of all, you can do various forms of psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, we relive and redefine the terms. We redefine what happened to us. We look at it through our id and our ego, through motivation theory, through Oedipal complexes, through codependence, attribution theory. There are any number of theories that we look at this sort of rename the problem in psychoanalysis. In Marxism, it's always interpreted in terms of dominance and subordination. In cognitive behavior modification, we come to realize what is it we're saying to ourselves when we get into these problems. And then we learn to tell ourselves something different, something that might be more effective. So we're kind of consciously reprogramming ourselves. In positive psychology, we pretty much ignore a lot of those things and focus on nurturing the genius and the talent within us to make life more fulfilling. We are, in most of these cases, existentially making or remaking ourselves. And there's no God necessary, no God really mentioned or allowed in any of those. Naturalism steps up to the plate when it deals with the consequences of unforgiveness. Consequences of unforgiveness tend to be depression and anxiety, two of the major ones. So from that, naturalism and any kind of science has developed drugs for the treatment. The issue in Christianity is that is a treatment for the symptoms, not one that you wouldn't necessarily deny, but you also wouldn't actually believe that the psychoneurochemical problem was actually necessarily the root of the issue. In Judeo-Christianity, it might be a spiritual thing like unforgiveness. And then there's a number of articles, recently a number of studies of something which the secularists call self-forgiveness. That's the way they're actually bringing in forgiveness but secularizing it versus God's forgiveness. Self-forgiveness, and we can talk about this in the question and answer session if you'd like, self-forgiveness is actually not a principle in Judeo-Christianity. Forgiving other people and being forgiven by God are principles in Judeo-Christianity. It's hard to know in self-forgiveness when you've done enough, when it's really gone, and by what authority we're actually forgiving ourselves. If Christianity is true, and it's right about the necessity of forgiveness, these two forms of forgiveness, then Judeo-Christian thought and solutions will be far more effective than secular psychological ones. The Missionaries of Charity, the Amish people, when their young women were killed a few years ago, did not go through psychological counseling. They sought the spiritual power that's available to them in Christianity from forgiveness. But in the university, the Judeo-Christian approach never gets raised. Why? Because of the secular imperative. The secular imperative inhibits the university from engaging spiritual phenomenon, in particular Christian spiritual phenomenon. Even though 1/3 of the world confesses to believe in Christ, and this is not limited by culture, race, by intellectual, being very bright or very simple, racial categories, or economic status. I mean, both poor and wealthy people are in this category. To not be taught about the Judeo-Christian framework, to not count that as one of the hypotheses behind things like depression and anxiety, despite the fact that the Western University actually emerged out of Christian monasteries, is to limit education. Secularism was once to have increased options. The reason for becoming secular in the university was to increase the options beyond the Judeo-Christian framework. Secularism claims right now to be more neutral, more objective, more open, more fair, more democratic, more pluralistic, and more safe than any other worldview. It has not proven itself to be any of these. Charles Taylor, a famous Canadian historian, wrote a massive history of the secular age. And he traces secularism over many, many centuries. And he says that this last age, these last couple of 100 years that we've been in, that this age he calls it the secular age. And he calls it the hegemonic master narrative of the age. Now, those of you who are in the social sciences hear these words a lot, but I'll unpack them for you. Master narrative is the story by which a culture lives its life. So the master narrative of the West has for many, many centuries been the Judeo-Christian story. Also, the master narrative is something that we might call capital T truth. Hegemonic means that a dominant power, secularism in this case, has convinced a subordinate power, Christianity in this case, that we simply must live by their rules for our good and for the good of all people, despite the fact that it will hurt us. I am suggesting tonight that the secular imperative has done three things to the university. First, it's diminished the university's wholehearted search for truth. Second, it has violated the university's own self-professed commitment to pluralism. And third, it has left us with an ideological-driven discourse that has language rules about what can and cannot be said. These are the reasons that I first wanted to lie about Mother Teresa. I knew the secular university could not receive it. If Christianity is true, and I'm going to end here, we're going to open for questions. If Christianity is true, and I obviously now believe it is, although I have not most of my life, then the university and the culture are diminished when we don't bring up those alternatives. And so I'd like to just stop there. I mean, even the things that Mother Teresa said, like small things with great love. I mean, there are many places that we could really talk about things that when she looked at justice, she felt like the reason there was so little justice in